Welcome back to the Stimpack Podcast, everybody. This is Jeff Frazier. I have a special treat for you today. We are welcoming a special guest, Vanda Felbab-Brown. She's a friend and colleague of mine. She represents the Brookings Institute. That's probably the leading most think tank in DC, based here in the U.S. I met her actually initially when I was released from captivity. I got debriefed by a bunch of different people, and she was one of them. So she was actually did probably like a 2-hour debrief interview to understand what I had learned and observed while behind enemy lines, so to speak. And she was fascinating. You know, she's incredibly well educated, got undergrad from Harvard, a PhD in political science from MIT, and then just a litany of experience around the world. She's this strange combination of intense scholar and adrenaline junkie, right? She's gone behind enemy lines to get the most minute detail and interview hundreds of people in various super intense conflict zones. Think Iraq and Afghanistan and the cartels of Mexico and of course Haiti. She's done the work to understand weapon systems that the good guys and the bad guys are using. That's the kind of granular education and training and experience that Vanda has and that she brings through the Brookings Institute and as a contribution to our nation. And we're thrilled to have her on the show today. So I hope that you'll enjoy this conversation as I did with Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown. All right, Vanda, great to have you. Thank you so much for being willing to join us. As you know, I'm a huge fan of your work, and so grateful to have you on here to share much of your expertise and specifically a lot of the work that you've been doing specifically targeted to Haiti. So excited to learn a lot about that in a minute. I would love it if, like my audience is used to, you'd tell us a little bit about your background as a person. Tell me a little bit about how you got attracted to this line of work, and because it's a truly exceptional role in the world, and we're grateful to have you do it. Tell me what got you there.
Well, first of all, Jeff, thank you so much for having me on a terrific show and a very important show. Haiti is deeply intertwined with the U.S. and the situation is critical, and yet is often very remote for people in the United States. So a brilliant podcast show. I'm delighted to being here.
Thank you. Very kind of you.
So, I have worked on what my friends call the depression portfolio of essentially criminality, insurgency, conflict, civil war, my entire professional career in very many different parts of the world. And I have spent a large part of my career and really enjoyed, and it's been terrific, being able to do field work in many places that are either in the throes of civil war or very intense violent criminality, which comes with its challenges. So how I started doing it really goes back to my undergrad, where I was at Harvard and I was doing, between my junior and senior year, I was going to write my senior thesis on what was a civil war in Algeria at the time, between an Islamist group and the Algerian government. And that civil war was really a very defining and important moment for Islamist groups, what would become really a cradle of Islamist terrorism, the way that the group is judged, whether they have a chance to be elected, whether governments would ever allow them to be elected, and bring in an Islamist agenda. And so between my junior and senior year, I got a grant to be doing field work in Europe, not in Algeria, which was still very much in the throes of the civil war. So going to different parts of Europe and interviewing government officials. But in the context of that work, I ended up interviewing all kinds of people from Algeria in exile. And a lot of that was very naive in the way one does operational security. And it was sort of a lesson in all the things one shouldn't do. But it was also really powerful. And I ended up hooked on the adrenaline, as well as got wiser with age in not doing all the kinds of stuff I did during that field work. But I also grew up in communist Czechoslovakia and came to the US in my early teens. But I grew up in the context of an authoritarian country, and country that was also part of the Soviet Empire. And those years, the difficulties of speaking truth to power, or really the inability to speak to truth to power, of living in the context of constant misinformation, what it meant fearing on a daily basis police that would be very heavily politicized, but also crucial parts of the makeup.
Fascinating. What do you think it is about you that has made you comfortable for an entire career to be facing these situations over and over and over again? I understand that the need, that whole truth to power kind of feels like maybe it's a fight for the underdog kind of a thing.
Yeah,
Is that maybe what it is?
I think it's definitely, fight for the underdog. In many ways, lots of the people I interact with are very marginalized people, whether they are just victims of terrible violence at the hands of insurgents or criminal groups, or victims of governments who repress and brutalize them because of different ethnicity, because of different political views, or because they simply make the judgment that living under an insurgent group or terrorist group without having any options makes the person be part of that group, or because they are very indiscriminate in what kind of policies they apply, be indifferent to what kind of civilian damage they cause in their policy responses. So I think that's part of it. But I would also say, the background in an authoritarian system really made me value the importance of freedoms, of civil liberties, the importance of courage to be willing to challenge those in power. And so I think that's a very important component of that. But look, it's not a joke, or not just a joke, that my friends call it my depression portfolio, because one of the things that I have really made the center, the hallmark of my work, has been not just to talk to governments or militaries in these contexts, but really get as much to the ground as possible. Talk with people who are living the daily reality, who are making daily survival choices, often very, very complex choices. And often their stories are just excruciating. And especially in the context of a world in which the powerful countries are more and more inward-looking, unwilling to provide aid, humanitarian aid, other kind of aid. More and more people around the world do not have an option, or do not have options, not even to escape, not even to migrate, because the world doesn't want migrants, as we are experiencing so dramatically in the United States. And so it's really hard to listen to just stories of excruciating suffering and no option out of it. And so I feel a commitment. I feel a commitment to these people to at least indirectly tell their story, even if it's not speaking about a particular individual, even if the chance that this will change policy might be limited.
Well, and we know that you have a massive influence on that, and so we're grateful that you do that work. So I want to get into, in just a minute, into the details of your recommendations and your assessment for Haiti right now today, because so much is happening. But before we get there, I want the audience to understand how you have collected this data, right? Tell them a little bit about maybe the last year or so, what you've been doing, what the nature of your own field work has been, to people who don't understand what that is, because I want them to understand how supremely qualified your assessments are.
Well, thank you. So, that's very kind of you to say. Of course, anytime you deal with very fluid situation, analyzing data is just hard, right? You might have different trends happening, and especially if you're assessing things like, will a group win or take over a country? Which group within the number of armed actors will prevail at any one particular moment? It's very hard. So none of us have a crystal ball, but thank you for your praise in advance. So I have, for the past, really, I guess, 2 years, year and a half, been interviewing as many people who work in Haiti, live in Haiti, or who work on Haiti as possible. And so, at this point, this would be hundreds of people or at least over 200 people, probably considerably more than that, in a wide sector of people. So this would be people who are political analysts, people who work in private security companies, people who are journalists, foreign or domestic, who work in international NGO efforts.
I don't know if you remember this, but you remember how we met.
Absolutely.
Was actually you called me to interview me after my kidnapping.
I remember that very well. I just didn't want to give it away, but I left it up to you to.
Fine. Yeah. So, yeah, that's for the audience. That's how we met. So we spent probably 2 hours on the phone. You asked every detail and I shared everything that I could. So I'm sure that's fairly a representative sample of one of the hundreds of interviews that you've conducted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
And,
great. So maybe you can, yeah.
Well, I was just also going to say, Haiti is, of course, not the first country that I worked on. And in fact, I have been working on other countries much longer, so on places like Afghanistan or Mexico for 25 years. And it's really hard to say that you're working on something for 25 years and to really date you. I don't have 25 years of work on Haiti. Being able to bring in comparative perspectives from the region and outside of the region has also been very useful in interpreting information that people give and in structuring and thinking about the type of individuals that are very important to speak with and whose perspectives matter.
Fantastic. So maybe tell us a little bit about your most recent observations. What work are you doing now? Because I want to start talking about what's happening right now in Haiti, because you've got such great perspective. What's some of the work that you've been doing recently? Yeah. So the last report I read of yours is a couple of months ago. It was very thorough report, super valuable, has been passed around many circles in DC as hugely influential. What have you been, maybe what you want to summarize on that, and then what you've done since?
Sure. Well, again, very many thanks for the kind words. So the report that you are referring to was written for the U.S. Institute for Peace and really mapped it was essentially a net assessment of different types of armed actors in Haiti. And I've used the term armed actors. That's controversial. It's certainly rejected in many quarters. So many people would say that a criminal group is not an armed actor. But let me be open-minded in our conversation today. I would say that a lot of the criminal gangs as they exist in Haiti are armed actors. And I would also apply that term to militia groups that have emerged vis-a-vis the actors. So that report really looked at both the criminal gangs and many of the different criminal gangs, but also the Haitian National Police, the army, the Wakale, the militia groups that operate in Haiti, as well as the UN-blessed, US-funded multinational support mission for Afghanistan that's called MSSM. Their capacities, their interests, and the balances of power that can be established, the effectiveness of policies that the MSSM has brought in. And the report was a very unhappy one because it concluded that the capacities of the multilateral support mission were vastly inadequate for the violent situation and the power of the gangs that the MSSM has been facing. And this would be even if the MSSM actually reached the full staffing, which it doesn't have. The numbers of the staffing have been changing, indicative of the struggle to staff the mission. At some point, the ambition was 3,000. At one point, it was even larger. Right now, we are somewhere under 1,000 personnel. But even if we got 3 times as much, in my view, that's still vastly inadequate. What was also another core finding of that report was the multifaceted growth in strength of the gangs, not just in the battlefield, although that's an important part of it, but also in their ambitions, political influence. And although there is wide variety of the gangs and they're not all equally powerful, they're certainly not all equally ambitious, they don't have equal political connections and capacities, the very powerful and very powerful gangs have become far more political in their outlook and far more politically savvy. So, the title of the report is Slipping the Leash, and that referred to the fact that for a long time, Haitian politicians have beneath criminal gangs or militias, variety of street armed actors for their political purposes. And gangs were one of these actors. And this goes back decades, back to the East, at least in Haiti. But what has happened over the past 10 years, especially acutely so, and then very much so in the past 3, 4, 5 years, is that the gangs no longer just obey the politicians or the businessmen. They dictate terms and they have their own ambitions. That doesn't mean that every single gang wants to topple the government and wants to rule, nor does it mean that the gangs have a vision of governance. This is not like the Taliban that had a vision of, when we take over Afghanistan, this is the kind of detailed governance that we will institute. The gangs don't have that. But they certainly are not just satisfied to be on the leash of the politicians. And the balance of power has dramatically changed. So what I've been doing since, in addition to kind of most immediate thinking of what can be done in the deteriorating situation we'll be talking about, is looking at different targeting policies and different targeting options, or even more broadly, different strategies for dealing with the gangs amidst a very unfavorable balance of power to the government, for the international community supporting the government, and looking at the effectiveness or the lack of, and risks and plus and cons and pros of policies such as high-value targeting. So one of the things you hear a lot is, if only the government were able to get rid of some key gang members, the situation would radically improve. It's a common view. So I'm looking at this theme in my recent work. If this so-called high-value targeting were adopted and executed, what would success mean? What would be the consequences? What is the likelihood that it could be executed effectively?
Well, so hold on. So you're saying that the international community is looking to consider various decapitation strategies or different approaches to the potential of decapitation. So eliminating high value targets. And you're saying that you've begun to consider the impact of that, or the opportunity or ability to achieve that?
Both of it. So what would be required to accomplish this strategy? What's the likelihood that the strategy could be mounted? And then, if you imagine leader X is taken out, what kind of effects would it likely have? Would it, in fact, produce collapse of the gang? I actually do not subscribe to the quite commonly shared belief that high-value targeting will be very effective and that it will significantly weaken the gangs. So, it's certainly true that you have some gangs that and gang leaders that are far more savvy and capable than others. These would be people like Jimmy Cherizier, whose nickname is Barbie, or a gang leader whose nickname is Izo, who is one of the gang leaders most involved in even international level, regional level drug trafficking. Nonetheless, the history of both decapitation in Haiti and decapitation around the world is that criminal groups and even insurgent groups are rather capable of replacing leaders. And we have seen that in Haiti repeatedly, not because the government in plural have had very successful decapitation strategy, but because you have incidences when rival gangs kill off gang leaders all the time, or lieutenants are paid by someone, police in Haiti at various times, or businesses in Haiti to decapitate a particular gang leader, or because you have essentially rebellion from within the gang. And some of the most dramatic examples of this was the death in late 2023 of a guy called Iskar, who had been heading the Jenin Alliance. So the gangs in Haiti have been constituted at least prior to a big truce around two big groupings. The groupings are pretty loose. They're called families, although often the bonds are far looser than in a family. And so Iskar was really the man, even more so than Jimmy Cherizier, who was heading the Jenin Alliance, and he gets killed in November 2023. And this certainly in the immediate circumstance created all kinds of internal problems within the alliance, and also specifically for Barbecue, who was facing all kinds of other challenges. So for Jimmy Charazier, his co-leader, if you would like, some would say his deputy, but co-leader, deputies, co-leader of the coalition. But it was also stunning how quickly the alliance shored up, how Charazier himself, who was facing all kinds of internal pressures from within the group and externally, was able to consolidate his power and arguably emerge even more powerful out of shifting and out of that decapitation. And this is just one story of where we see that repeatedly. So the first notion, if you take out the leader, the gang will collapse, often doesn't materialize. The second element is, though, that the transition to a new leader can be very violent. And the violence is not beneficial to the state necessarily. The violence can really complicate the security situation even more. Governments in general struggle when they have to act against very many armed groups. That is hardly true just about Haiti. But it also tends to be really terrible for people who live in the violent areas, who live in the neighborhood that are contested among gangs. So violence as a result
let
of
me ask you a question there. So
is not benevolent.
let me ask you a quick question along that. So the violence I think you're referring to is the intergang, between gangs, gang on gang violence. Viva Ensemble, for the audience, is a coalition, right? You're probably looking at, I don't know, 10 to 15 different kind of discrete gangs that have agreed to ally, and throughout history, these guys have all fought each other, right? And even when I was in captivity, there was intergang fighting happening. And then also they were fighting against the police, and they were fighting against the population. That's that Boakale movement that we've discussed. So if the gangs are successfully able to pick one enemy, meaning the state or the MSS, rather than each other, that is a massively effective strategy for them. And I would say that they've been largely successful, shockingly successful, since Viva Ensemble has become a thing, in not being so angry at each other, where they're just fighting block to block for their own territory. Vanda, would you agree with that assessment? That they've largely held the alliance together?
No, absolutely. I agree with you. I would say stunningly, and not in a positive way, but like in a shocking way, successful, right? So Viva Ensemble emerged with just the deal, the pact that brought together two sets of gangs that were at each other's throats, that defined themselves as core enemies. Into a truce at first in the summer of 2023. Then it seemed to be kind of collapsing. When Iskar was killed, that was seen as a death knell for Viva Ensemble. And then 3 months later, we see Viva Ensemble being resurrected at a strength that few imagined, and taking on the state to an extent that they were able to get rid of the Prime Minister Ariel Henry, and that came just short of completely taking over seats of power in the country. And then the expectation was that as the gangs accomplished deposing Henry, and as a new government was instituted, eventually the international force arrived, that we would see the gangs turning on each other. And that didn't happen. And again, we are a year at this point from when the Henry government fell. We are recording in late March 2025. Coordination, first of all, the non-aggression among each other, as well as the coordination against state and now the MSSM, is really palpable and very dramatic. That doesn't mean, however, that if we end up with one of the drones that the government is now flying, taking out someone like Vitelom, which is another of the gang leaders, or Barbecue with Charazier, that we will not see fighting over territories, whether it's between different gangs who are trying to fill the void, or within the gang itself, as they're fighting over establishment of who takes over the leadership.
Just so the audience understands, the drones that Vanda just mentioned, these are small drones. So think 24-inch square drones with some sort of explosive attached to them. So they're actually smaller than what I've even seen what they're using in Ukraine. I don't know where they're getting them. And Vanda, you don't have to answer that.
Well,
even if you do
I
not.
would just say that well before the government of Haiti, the Haitian National Police has now mounted these drones, the Haitian gangs were actually flying drones themselves, both for reconnaissance
Reconnaissance.
and integration of operations. But for several years now, we have the Mexican cartels using these off-the-shelf drones that one can easily buy just in stores. With very primitive explosives to conduct all manner of operations against the Mexican government, against Mexican government officials, but also for the purpose of large-scale depopulation. So just a little bit of a diversion, something that we might end up seeing in Haiti. It would be really
Yes,
terrible.
but to be clear to the audience, we have not seen that from
Right.
the gangs in Haiti yet. Only the MSSM has that.
Correct.
Currently.
Yeah, so the Haitian gangs have only been using them for intel, but look, it's not very easy. It's not very difficult to weaponize it. But it's very primitive, very inaccurate.
Yes. Yeah. Good. So let's move toward, if you're okay with it, your thoughts on aggression, both up in the hills, so the Kenskov, Thomason kind of area, that kind of aggression coming. So just for the audience's edification, that if you imagine Port-au-Prince is on foothills, right? So the water is pretty close. So you've got the Port-au-Prince, right, which is literally the water, and then close to that is the airport, and then there's just sloping foothills, and most of the city is on those foothills. And the higher you go up, the nicer and fancier it is. That's where the hotels and things like that are. And if you go higher up there, you eventually get these kind of wooded homes. And that's an area called Kenskov, and there's some other areas. And while those areas have been largely off limits to the gangs, that's not the case anymore. So now you've got heavy attacks coming from the gangs from above, right? So they've come over the mountains, and now they're coming down onto the fancy neighborhoods. And that is a particularly bold move, because that's largely where many of the power brokers in Haiti are. So you're kind of striking them at the heart of their own neighborhoods. And so lucky for them, they've got the money to mount a bit of a defense, but the gangs aren't giving up. But Vanda, I'd love to hear your take on that, the level of aggression that's been cranked up in that area.
Yeah, I mean, far from giving up, I would say that we are really seeing unprecedented onslaught push by the gangs, at least since the effort to get rid of Henri. And I would say that in many ways it's even more profound than the effort to get rid of Henri. So one of the things that your listeners need to understand is that there is thick relationship and engagement between Haitian politicians and the criminal gangs, also between Haitian businessmen and the criminal gangs. And both politicians and important members of the business community have long been used to using gangs for their purposes, whether it's brutalizing the opposition, getting votes, eliminating business opposition, or getting getting safer access on certain roads at the expense of the rival. But even when we think of the desire to get Prime Minister Henri, who was in power as a result of the assassination of the former president, who had not been elected, was widely seen as illegitimate, had certain core supporters and other core political opponents. The violence was against an individual or set of individuals. The push now into the top areas that you were speaking about is much more open challenge to the political class and to the business class overall. I don't want to make the claim, and I don't believe that this is the gangs against every politician or every businessman. The allegiances are still there, but they're being contested. And the level of threat that the business and political elite now feels, I would say, is even greater than, or in some ways even greater, than when we had the push against Henri. So first of all, the notion that people could somehow insulate themselves from violence if they have sufficient power and if they have sufficient money is being challenged. But also the political bargain is being challenged really in a profound way. Now, I don't believe that we are in a situation where the bargain inevitably has to collapse. I think that the gangs are still looking for some renegotiations of the bargain. I think that the current violence is also a response to policies like using the drones for decapitations. The government hasn't succeeded in killing any prominent gang leader with this approach yet. So it's also very much, in my view, about deterrence. The coercion, the push is saying, okay, you don't do this to us. It's about balancing of power. There is the fantasy that Haiti might have elections. In my view, that could only happen if there are new bargaining arrangements from the politicians with the gang leaders and they're looking for payoff. I don't want to give the impression that the gangs are completely throwing the system under the bus and that they just want to completely take over the state. But they're coming close, and they're certainly saying that the price that used to be, the arrangements that used to be, are now being profoundly renegotiated. And of course, it's not just threat to the people at the hills and as individuals. Those areas control water supply to Port-au-Prince. The gangs already control all roads, essentially in and out of Port-au-Prince. Some of the gangs, like ESOs, have very large maritime assets by Haitian standards, by gang standards, and we're talking a few boats, but more than the Haitian Coast Guard has, or at least more operational boat than the Coast Guard had. So there is very much a sense of encirclement and siege in the city. I argued last year when things seemed to be calming down in May, June, July, when the MSSS was arriving, that the declines in attacks, that the not taking the presidential palace, not taking the airport, were not because the Haitian police, supplemented later on by the MSSM, were really able to defend them, but because the gangs make a choice not to go for them now. But right now, at the end of March, as we're recording the podcast, more and more people in Haiti are afraid that the gangs will actually go for taking over those seats of power. Now, there's different difficulties. International MSSM force is parked at the airport. So, if they wanted to seize the airport, it's a different scenario than last spring. It would be much harder for them. They would presumably encounter significant pushback from the MSSM. But nonetheless, the situation is dire. That's just in the broader political balance of power picture for individual people in Haiti and in Port-au-Prince. The situation can be absolutely dire. We see mass amount of displacement in Port-au-Prince over the past month, some 60,000 people. People often don't have any areas to go anymore. This is part of, even just going upper on the hills, that there's just inability to move. By some accounts, 9 out of 10 people in Haiti do not eat every single day. At least half of the population is food insecure, which is a gentle term for the brutality of starvation, famine. Employment opportunities are very minimal. Schools are not functioning. Thousands of schools have been not functioning or destroyed. Maybe 1/3, of the country's hospital work. And when we say 1/3, it doesn't mean 1/3 uniformly distributed across the country. You could have zero or very, very few in a very large area. The northern part of the country is in a better security situation than Port-au-Prince. So it's not all uniformly distributed. So the daily situation is just horrendous for people. And now on top of that, we have the administration removing protections for the Haitian people who were given temporary status in the United States.
U.S.
So these individuals will be deported, will face massive hardships, but it also means big decline in remittances, a lifeline for many, many families and for the economy, and a big decline in, on top of already a big decline as humanitarian aid has been cut off.
So let's talk about solutions. So the recommended strategy that you would consider, whether it be on one end of the spectrum, you've got very low international interest to support Haiti, right? If no one's coming to the rescue, Haiti should do X. If somebody wants to come to the rescue and is going to crank up the dial and spend a little more money, how do they do that in a responsible and effective way in your estimation? Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, let me start with the easier one, but the one that's also very elusive. It is clear that we Haiti, those who care about Haiti need a much larger force than the MSSM, much more robust force. The MSSM is composed of a variety of police officers with variety of training. The bulk of the forces come from Kenya, and many of these forces were given U.S. counterterrorism training and applied it in various ways in Kenya. But you have supplements to the force from various Caribbean countries or Latin American countries that could be very small deployments on the order of tens of individuals or less per country, all of which creates just massive operational challenges. A lot of the force is understaffed. But overall, the force is understaffed, and a lot of the people are undertrained. They are really facing a warfare, urban warfare situation, and they have nowhere the training, the resources, the equipment, the skills to be operating, and the rules of engagement, the permissions from their governments to be operating in this. If tomorrow the MSSM disappeared because all funding was stopped, or because the countries just decided they wanted to preserve their people, we just had a second MSSM officer killed, second Kenyan officers killed.
Yeah.
The country would just go to the gangs.
Today.
Would go to the gangs. Now, the MSSM has really not been improving the security situation. It's just been slowing the rate of deterioration.
Slowing it, yeah.
So, if in a world when the world cares and is willing to staff it and pay for it, we need a much larger force. That's not an easy proposition. Haiti has had a variety of large forces, including MINUSTA, a UN-led force that became very, very, very controversial, deeply resented, implicated in sexual abuse, in the spread of cholera, in very many problems. But the reality is that a small limited force, whether it's 3,000 or 5,000, is just not going to cut it. And we will just be living different versions of what 2024 was like with the MSSM. So much larger force that has air components and not just little drones with, what's called sometimes potato bomb, very primitive detonation device. Air components, so helicopters for sure, far more powerful, effective drones, including for intelligence, sustainability to stay in the air. One of the problems with the drones is that the payloads are limited. So you can fly them, they try to find the target, however good or bad that policy is, but they cannot stay and hover very long, so they either drop and go back or they just stop functioning. And I think you would also need a really different strategy that needs to, in my view, create kind of concentric circles of improving security. But we are nowhere at this place, right? So there was a hope in the fall that the MSSM mission would be headed as an official UN peacekeeping force. If that had happened, there was hope that there would be more money, more financial resources, and greater stability and predictability of the payments. That's, of course, before the Trump administration, where there is just overall uncertainty today, whether the Trump administration will be funding peacekeeping operations anywhere in the world and what scale and rate. But you also have challenges on the UN Security Council about agreement for that. So that reality just seems completely elusive. What does it then mean? Well, if no one's willing to come in, although you see every so often protesters and even politicians in Haiti suggest that maybe a private security force should arrive. I think Haiti is in such a situation that a responsible, competent Western security company is better than just collapse that we're seeing in the absence of an international UN peacekeeping, much larger UN mission. The problem has all along been who will pay for the Western private security companies. So now you're seeing, once again, Haitian protesters, Haitian even politicians calling for Russia's Wagner group, which is now called Africa Corps, to deploy to Haiti. Now, this would be massive change in how the United States and Russia and Soviet Union have operated, how they saw Latin America. I think it would be deeply detrimental to U.S. interests. But you start seeing these calls once again because there is such desperation in Haiti. The alternative is we will not have any injection of power. From an injection of military power from the outside. The outcome then is an outcome that's undesirable, but also understandable. That is that we will see rebrokering of deals and relations between Haitian politicians and gangs. Now, that process could be difficult and
So,
violent.
and of course, that's going to be a frustrating thing because nobody wants that lack of justice, right? Everyone
Right,
wants justice
absolutely.
for the atrocities that have been committed.
Absolutely. And it's both, lack of justice, but it's also just repeating the same pattern that keeps bringing us to these moments, because that those bargains are inherently unhealthy and unstable for a country. But without an external injection of power, I don't see how internally there is anything that could challenge the gangs. So we either have outright takeover of the
Okay,
country by the gangs.
let me ask you this. I would love your response to this. So, and I'm of course not recommending this. Is just observation of a dynamic that could occur. One of the reasons that this dynamic to which you referred before, which is where you've got these oligarchs who puppeteer the gangs in many ways. And so one of the reasons that those oligarchs are being attacked right now in Kenskoff, like we mentioned before, is because the money has stopped flowing. Those oligarchs had been paying the gangs for many years. And then a lot of sanctions came down from the international community, which the oligarchs used as an excuse or cover to stop paying. Right, which makes sense and it's convenient for us, and that's the intent of sanctions, right? Is to stop that money from flowing, and that money has been coming from corruption and all the different kinds of corruption, whether it be from government or from businesses, and all those sources. So that dynamic, that corruption-driven funding that eventually flows down to the gangs, and now the fact that is stopped in some ways by choice by these oligarchs, can that whole system blowing up get us to a point where there is no value flow from the oligarchs to the gangs, and then you don't get a recycling of this dynamic because there is no value flow? Is that a possibility?
I mean, it's certainly a possibility. I don't think it's very likely, though. So I think that when it comes to the gangs completely taking over, burning down a house of an individual or burning down the national palace, we will see resurrection of the value flow in the first place. But also, let's imagine that the politicians are just no more paying. The gangs have other income. Drug trafficking is an important income for some of them and will be growing in importance, but also just generalized extortion of just daily life. And we would have to have complete halt of every economic activity for there not to be money to be made from this extortion. Of course, the more the economy shuts down, the smaller the extortion rents payments will be. But it's very difficult to imagine that we would have zero cash going to the gangs. So say that there's no more payments.
Sure.
Then we would have, I think, two situations. The gangs just overtly take over, or the government role becomes completely irrelevant. So it's either, in many ways, it's like sort of Somalia in 2011, 2010 kind of scenario. So the government is tiny, hunkering down in like few buildings, but really unable to do anything in of itself. And the gangs rule whether they fly a flag over the national palace or they don't fly a flag. Now, if we got to this situation where there is no more state, there is no more the enemy, there is no more payments from the politicians, then you first of all have the possibility of the Viva Ensemble collapsing and violence spreading between the gangs, or you would have the gangs need to reach out to some politicians, whether old-timers or newcomers, people like Guy Philippe, to be running the country. Ultimately, gangs can run thieves, they can run limited territories, but they don't have the capacity to be engaging in anything like running the national economy. And of course, they'll also face sanctions from the international community, even if the international community does nothing other than like totally embargo and sanction Haiti. So I actually think that the gangs would go for putting forward some politician, new or old, to be running the country on their behalf.
Well, and the bigger issue is if they keep courting Russia and China, who fill in that vacuum. If we create the vacuum, I think we're pretty confident who fills that vacuum. Vanda, thank you so much for your time today. You've been spectacular. I know we could talk forever. Are there any parting points that you would like to make before we let you go?
Sure. The parting point I would make is, look, we need great empathy with the people in Haiti. And that means both being generous and supporting them in wise ways in Haiti, but also supporting people who are migrants. And vilifying migrants, stopping remittances is bad not just for Haiti and humanity. It's not just bad for individuals, for people of Yad as a country, as an individual, but it's also bad for us because we could also have Haiti becoming an outright crime island, where it becomes the epicenter of drug trafficking in the Caribbean. It's already a drug smuggling place, but it could just become outright crime state. That is bad for us. And anytime we allow as a country to treat people brutally because they don't have US citizenship, we are just teaching US law enforcement forces to one day start treating in the same way, without warrants, without respect towards rule of law, U.S. citizens in the same way.
Well, thank you so much, Vanda. Your time is immensely valuable. So grateful to have you on. Love your perspective, love your work, and thank you for doing it. We're all better for it. So thank you again.
And thank you.
Have a great one. Hopefully
much.
We'll have you on again at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me on the show and your support and very, very kind words.
You got it. You got it. Thanks, Vanda.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Stimpack Podcast, Season 3. Will you please subscribe, rate, review, and share it with your friends and colleagues? Thank you for your help. This podcast has been brought to you by Stimpack Incorporated. Copyright 2024. All rights reserved.